This episode of Trifles is brought to you by the BSI Press. Manuscripts, collections of papers by international writers, and books covering a wide range of other Sherlockian topics. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And by listeners like you, who choose to support us on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Go to patreon.com/trifles to learn more. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the problem was final, the house was empty, and his bow was last, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Why would the Pope engage Sherlock Holmes' services? Why did he receive the Legion of Honor from France? And why would he refuse a knighthood?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 354, By George. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we get into the minutiae in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
You're not George?
He was here a minute ago.
I was told George would be here. Let George do it, they said.
What about George and Marion? Do you remember that in Topper? Those were the names of
sure.
Of the ghosts.
My goodness.
George, Marion.
Well, I'm reminded of my childhood a long time ago now, where my grandfather, who had a rather dry sense of humor, when he was ready to depart from our house and head back across town to his house, he would look at my grandmother and say, "You ready, George?" And, of course, her name wasn't George. It wasn't Georgina. It wasn't anything close. Her name was Anne. And I always asked him, "Why do you call her George?" He goes, "I don't know. It just feels right."
Just feels right, huh?
So,
and did he call you Dave?
He did not.
Did he call the automobile umbrella, for example? You know, I frequently drive in the rain, so I've taken to calling my car umbrella. It feels right. It just feels right.
It was later on that we had to commit him to the Connecticut home for the marginally sane.
For the occasionally confused.
No.
That's where I'm going. I'm going to the home for the
we hope to provide a little less confusion here today. We're looking at the phrase "by George." It is something that is almost synonymous with English conversation, British conversation. But it does crop up from time to time across a number of stories. And I thought we might take a little quizzical approach here. We'll test each other's knowledge. And, dear listener, you can play along as well as we look at these instances of By George. We should tell you that the show notes for this episode are available at ihose.co/trifles354, all lowercase. That'll take you to the SherlockHolmesPodcast.com website where you can sign up for email updates, look at those links that we place in the show notes, and get to our Patreon page, which if you'd like to go there directly is patreon.com/trifles. There you will find all of our episodes, and they are available for Patreon supporters without ads, without those pesky interruptions in the middle of the show. We also do occasional bonus content and additional community discussion there for our Patreon supporters. So if you would like to be part of that, get those additional elements that we mentioned, you can do so for as little as $1 a month. And you can get to all of that simply from the SherlockHolmesPodcast.com website. Okay, by George. I thought it might be interesting, Bert, and you are Bert, correct?
Well, I'm not going to be declarative one way or the other about that.
Well, either way, I thought it might be interesting to look at where By George came from an etymological standpoint.
Yes.
What do we know about the history or an origin of By George?
Well, it appears to be a linguistic approach to avoid using the Lord's name in vain. And it goes back to the late 16th century. So that would be the 1500s, probably. So the idea was, rather than using the euphemism by God, you would, or before God, I pledge this or declare that, you would say, by George. And apparently it began as before George, and then it became by George. And it's the first source of it, according to some source, the first appearance of it. So, if you look in the Oxford English Dictionary, you generally find the first appearance of these things. Some people say it's in the late 15th century, but apparently it pops up in Henry VI, Part 1, which Shakespeare wrote, right about 1890 or 1891. Actually, I think
15.
Well,
90, not 1890.
Oh, right. Sorry, 1590, 1591. The deal there is with the history plays. Apparently, the first play Shakespeare wrote was Henry VI, Part 2, and these things didn't become a triumvirate, Part 1, Part 2, Part 3, until after they were all completed. So he wrote Part 2 first, and then wrote Part 3, what we know as Part 3, and then after that wrote essentially the prequel, and then...
That's like Star Wars. It's amazing.
It is like Star Wars, yeah. Exactly right, yeah. But anyway, it goes back at least as far as 1590, let's say, if not a little before that, into the 1400s.
Well, and it makes a lot of sense from a British standpoint because, of course, St. George is the patron saint of England. So, if you're going to swear an oath, if you're going to substitute, using the Lord's name, well, you may as well use your patron saint's name. So it doesn't get much more British than that, I suppose. Well, why don't we hop along now for a few instances of By George in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I mean, this is something that crops up a number of times, and interestingly, it may actually appear more times than the classic elementary. Now, we know Holmes never said elementary, my dear Watson, in the stories, but he did say elementary, or it is elementary. But I have, I think, 11 instances of By George, according to my record keeping. But I wonder how many instances of elementary there are in the canon. I'm just thinking, off the top of my head here. I can only... Let me see. I'll go into the search here. Elementary. 8 instances of elementary, and they're not all exclamatory remarks. Amusing, really? Though rather elementary, from Case of Identity.
Only 8?
Yeah. Elementary, said he. It is one of those instances where the reasoner can produce an effect which seems remarkable to his neighbor. I was in The Crooked Man.
That. Yeah.
Interesting, though elementary, from The Hound of the Baskervilles.
Well, elementary. I mean, it's. I know this sounds silly, but basically, it's just a word. It's just.
Well, right.
It's basically like saying simple.
That's correct.
It's only in the sort of post-canonical world when it's become elementary, my dear Watson. That became a popular thing for people to pluck into their own conversations, even though it had no Sherlockian origin.
Yeah. Well, it certainly has become synonymous with Sherlock Holmes, right up there with the Inverness Cape and the Calabash Pipe and the Deerstalker.
And the Calabash is as non-canonical as Elementary, My Dear Watson.
Exactly.
But you
exactly.
mentioned this was going to be a quiz.
Yes.
And so I'm very interested to learn, what's the prize? What can I win here?
What's the prize?
Yeah, what am I going to win?
You will win my by George, let me tell you what you will win.
Tell me.
Bert, you will win a wonderful copy of our home game, a year's supply of turtle wax.
A copy of our home game.
I know you are. But you'll also get a year's supply of turtle wax and Rice-A-Roni, the San Francisco treat.
I want some of the. I want a tin of Big Boy mustache wax as advertised in the Strand in 1894.
That's great. I'll give you a tin of that and Prince Albert in a can.
No, thank you.
Make sure you let him out when you get him.
Fresher in the pouch, though.
I know. Well, let's get right to this. Let's cue up the quiz and see how you do. I'm going to give you the first question, and we'll see if you can identify which story this came from, and we'll continue some probing once you get that right. So here's the excerpt. He had turned suddenly, and his long, thin finger was pointing to a hole which had been drilled right through the lower window sash, about an inch above the bottom. "By George!" cried the inspector. "However did you see that?" "Because I looked for it." What story is that from, and what was Sherlock Holmes looking for?
Well, that is from the sad death of Hilton Cubitt, isn't it?
That's correct. In which story?
Well, that's The Dancing Men.
Right.
And Holmes is looking for, it's already occurred to him, for reasons that will shortly be revealed, that there was more than one gunshot, and so therefore he was looking for this other bullet.
That is correct. Now, this is going to be a little bit more of a stretch. Do you remember the inspector's name?
Dave. I think the inspector's
Inspector Dave. No, I'm sorry. We were looking for Inspector Gadget.
It wasn't Inspector Gregory, was it?
No, it was not. This is a one-off inspector. Didn't appear in any other story.
I don't remember.
Inspector Martin.
Inspector Martin.
Yes.
How interesting.
Yes, indeed. I don't know if I would have gotten that if I did not have the answer key in front of me.
Well, that's the thing. These exclamatory points are things one never pays attention to, and that's why it's interesting. Like your search for elementary, just to see, because part of the attraction and interest of the cases of Sherlock Holmes is language and what they tell us about the time. But I'll ask you a question then. So,
okay.
Here's one, and it's another case where Holmes is remonstrating against himself. He's sort of slapping his head. How could I have been so ignorant, he says. And of course, this is another great phrase that we've already explored elsewhere, particularly in looking at the Natural History series. Holmes says, "Oh, what a blind beetle I have been, not to draw my conclusion." Oh. And then Watson says, "Well, so what's your conclusion?" He says, "Only that it is a remarkable cow which walks and canters and gallops." By George, Watson, it was no brain of a country publican that thought out such a blind as that.
That's great. Well, the case of the remarkable cow, which I think this should have been the name of the story.
No, that was his last cow. That was the one about the Nazis. No, that was the one about World War I. Yeah.
The remarkable cow, unknown to science. Yes. His last cow. That's great. No, of course, this is the Priory School. We're talking about the Holderness family, which had earned a lot of its early money from trafficking cows and disguised them as horses. So, yeah, that was when Holmes figured out that the tracks that they got were not cow tracks, of course. And the country publican he mentions there was, of course, Reuben Hayes. And Reuben Hayes was not too bright of a fellow, so Holmes knew that he couldn't have come up with this plan and knew that there had to be someone else involved, someone close to the Holderness family.
Very good.
That's a good one, yeah. Okay, well, we'll do a twofer for this one because there are two instances of By George in this story, and they're both uttered by the same person. I want you to tell me who the person is and what the story is. So the first excerpt is, "Where did you get that dog cart? Pull up, man," he yelled, drawing a pistol from his side pocket. "Pull up, I say, or by George, I'll put a bullet into your horse." Holmes threw the reins into my lap and sprang down from the cart. And then later on in that same story, Holmes is narrating back to the individual who says, "By George," he says, "Meanwhile, your arrangement was rather upset by the fact that you yourself had fallen in love with the lady. You could no longer bear the idea of this ruffian owning her." "No, by George, I couldn't." What was the story and who said that?
Well, all of that is the solitary cyclist. And in the first instance, it's Holmes who's calling out, I think. Holmes is the one who's calling out and throws the reins into Watson's. No, that's not the case. Holmes is the one who's driving the car.
That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah, and so that is also the same person then, who is in the next excerpt, where when Holmes says, you could no longer bear the idea of this ruffian, and he says, "No, by George, I couldn't." So in those cases, the "by George" is spoken by Carruthers. Wasn't it Carruthers who's
Big Bob Carruthers? That's
Big
right.
Bob. Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess I don't know if this is ever ascertained, but is he in fact the solitary cyclist, or is Violet Smith the solitary cyclist?
He's the one because the solitary cyclist was the mysterious person who was following Violet on her rides because he wanted to protect her. And so he was the cause of, why she goes to Holmes, among other things. She says all these strange happenings.
There you go. Well, let's take a quick break here, let our brains relax a little bit, and then we'll come back for the second half of this By Georgian quiz. In 2023, the BSI Press has added more titles to its roster that you won't want to miss. First up this year is the latest in the BSI manuscript series, a title that takes you, maybe a moment to connect to the story. The Haven Horror. If you guessed the adventure of the retired colorman, you're more clever than Josiah Amberley. This manuscript, once owned by Dame Jean Conan Doyle and bequeathed to the British Museum, is a very clean one, coming as it did at the conclusion of the canon. But the essays that accompany it are wonderfully informative. Dan Andriaco looks at prostheses in the canon. The BSI's resident toxicologist, Marina Stayich, brings us into the realm of poisons. And our own Bert Wolder tells about the life of the artist Frank Wiles. These and more are colorful, just as colorful as the original story that acted as a metaphor and reality, and it treats the reader to a kaleidoscope of shades and hues that will provide hours of reading pleasure. Be sure to get your copy of The Haven Horror before it's sold out at BakerStreetIrregulars.com today. By George, we're back. How did we do it? And we are going to continue quizzing each other on these instances of the exclamation "By George" in the canon.
Yeah. Now here's one I will ask you. So there's plenty of cases of Sherlock Holmes where they come upon a crime scene. And here's one. Holmes and Watson drive up and find the railings in front of a house lined by a crowd, a very curious crowd, and Holmes whistled. Now, see, there's something we need to look into. How many times does Holmes whistle in the canon? But then, after his tune, Holmes says, "By George, it's attempted murder at the least. Nothing else will hold the London message boy. There's a deed of violence indicated in that fellow's round shoulders and outstretched neck."
Well, see, how does he know that the London message boy would only be curious about murder? I mean, I can think of at least a half dozen other things that message boys might crane their necks for.
Well, but it's because he wrote a trifling monograph on the subject of
neck cranes.
On the subject of neck cranes and the expression of interest in foul deeds. And so, for example, mere pickpocket work doesn't result in sort of any change in the perspective or holding of one's head, but it may involve a raised eyebrow. However,
I was thinking it might have been a game of high-stakes jacks or marbles. Who knows? But that aside, this, of course, was in The Six Napoleons. The London message boy was at the doorstep of Horace Harker, I believe, where... who was it? Petrucci? Is that the... Venucci. Venucci had been found with his throat slashed. So...
Oh, right. Well,
yeah.
Yeah, no, I guess that's right.
Yeah.
But see, isn't that interesting? I never noticed in that particular line. It's another fascinating point, isn't it? That's a comment Holmes is making about someone in the crowd. He says there's a deed of violence indicated in that fellow's round shoulders and outstretched neck. And if you think about it, round shoulders pulled back, neck craning, it's a perfect little description of someone, curiously peering at something. Very interesting.
Absolutely is. Well, so this one is interesting. This is... Well, I'm not going to give away who said it. I'll let you figure that out. But you also have to figure out the story. This is an instance when Holmes presents certain knowledge to an inspector, and the inspector then takes it and leaves the scene for a bit to allow Holmes and Watson some time among themselves. So here's the excerpt. "Well, take my advice. Examine him carefully. Don't do it before us. We'll wait here. You take him into the back room. You'll be more likely to get a confession out of him alone. Ask him how he dared to admit people and leave them alone in this room. Don't ask him if he has done it. Take it for granted. Tell him you know someone has been here. Press him. Tell him that a full confession is his only chance of forgiveness. Do exactly what I tell you. By George, if he knows, I'll have it out of him." He darted down the hall, and in a few moments, his bullying voice sounded from the back room. What was the story, and who was the bullying inspector?
Oh, that's just lovely, isn't it? Particularly, the line, his bullying voice sounded from the back room, because the whole thing, is very cinematic. If you were watching this on the screen, you would have that sound, you have that Foley work in the background, and you'd be listening to that. Really interesting. Well, that's the second stain, and that's Inspector Lestrade, and this is one of the few cases, or several cases in the canon, where it's the inspector who sounds off with a "By George."
Very well done. And I think you're absolutely right about that being a very cinematic scene, because we continue from there, and suddenly Holmes and Watson rip the carpet back and are searching frantically over the floor for the false bottom to the floor. It just wonderfully done.
Yeah, and Holmes is organizing everything, for Lestrade there. Hey, do this and then do that and then do this and do that.
Yep.
And then he runs off and he says, good, that'll keep him busy for a while. Right? Yeah. Well, here's another one where this is not Holmes speaking by George, but there are so many scenes in the canon where the geography and the atmosphere become central to the story. And here's a case where a character is remarking about that. He says, only yesterday I saw one of the moor ponies wander into it. He never came out. I saw his head for quite a long time craning out of the bog hole, but it sucked him down at last. Even in dry seasons, it's a danger to cross it. But after these autumn rains, it's an awful place. And yet I can find my way to the very heart of it and return alive. By George, there is another of those miserable ponies.
Well, this can be from only one story, and that is, of course, The Hound of the Baskervilles. And I think that was Stapleton, who was... I don't know if he was truly horrified or if he was feigning it, because he had become, well, we all know what kind of an individual Stapleton was, but perhaps he was exaggerating his reaction for Dr. Watson's effect.
Yes, trying to present himself as being concerned.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you an easy one here. What story is this from? By George, it's marvelous, cried Hopkins in an ecstasy of admiration. To think that I had all that evidence in my hand and never knew it. I had intended, however, to go round to the London opticians.
Oh, the London opticians. Well, you've already said it's Stanley Hopkins, and then the opticians means that it must be the golden pince-nez.
Right-ho. Well done. And this was something that, Hopkins was admired by Holmes, but he was on the right track, but didn't quite put all of the pieces together.
Well, then, here's another one that's well, I don't know. It's a lovely. These are interesting because they're all around. In some cases, really definitive or characteristic moments of a particular case. But there's one case that begins, arrangements have been made, an advertisement has been posted in the newspaper, and this is being read aloud by the character, and you'll hear who says it in a second. He's reading, tonight, same hour, same place, 2 taps. Most vitally important, your own safety at stake. Pierrot. By George, cried Lestrade. If he answers that, we've got him.
Oh, I didn't know Poirot was in the Sherlock Holmes stories.
As things, there's an advertisement.
No, of course, that is from the Bruce Partington plans. Interesting that By George should happen in both Sherlock Holmes stories that involved international spies. The Second Stain, which we mentioned before, and now the Bruce Partington plans. Perhaps that oath to St. George is protecting the homeland against infiltrators. Well, speaking of foreign infiltrators, let's try this. Giant as he was, the man must have gone down like a pole-axed ox before that terrific blow. Beside his right hand, a most formidable horn-handled, 2-edged dagger lay upon the floor, and near it, a black kid glove. By George, it's Black Gorgiano himself, cried the American detective. Someone has got ahead of us this time. The story.
Someone has got ahead of us this time, Mr. Holmes.
That's an American accent.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
American inspector.
Somebody's got ahead of him this time, Mr. Holmes. It's wonderful too. I didn't pick it up before, but the line there, and near it, a black kid glove. You know, the black hand.
Yeah.
So this is the red circle.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, and it's our pal, he's not a Pinkerton man, though, is he?
That's right.
He is a Pinkerton
It
man?
is a Pinkerton man.
Yeah.
Do you remember who it was?
Yeah, it was Joe Schlabotnik. No, it was Wilson. No, Wilson Hargreaves was in New York.
He's from New York.
I don't remember who the American.
Mr. Leverton.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mr. Leverton.
Well done. And he, of course, was there with Gregson, Inspector Gregson, making his reappearance. So.
Interesting, too, the line, man must have gone down like a pole-axed ox.
Mm.
You know, the X's in those two words. It must have been fun to write.
Much more fun than it is to say.
Yeah.
Have you ever been pole-axed?
No, happily. No. Well, and then we have a case where, it's a case where, unlike the others that we've looked at, the villain is using this expression. And it's pretty, another one of these great distinctive moments. And so you have to identify the case, really. But the line is, I remember, Holmes gasped, the spring, it drew blood, this box, this on the table. And then the line, the very one, by George, and it may as well leave the room in my pocket. And there goes your last shred of evidence.
Oh, boy. Oh, boy. Well, of course, this is Holmes from his sickbed and the dying detective facing off with one Culverton Smith, who admitted his plan in the presence of Watson, who was hiding behind the headboard. Wow. Well done.
Watson hidden behind the headboard saying, Holmes, I didn't realize you were so much of an enthusiastic consumer of chewing gum.
By George, where'd all this gum come from?
Oh, by George, Watson, I typically, at the end of a long day, park a stick or so behind there for the following morning, and I usually forget.
Well, by George, I know.
Occasionally, Mrs. Hudson comes in and scrapes it all off.
Well, let's just leave it there and say, by George, this was trying to be a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
Tell him you know someone has been here. Press him. Tell him a full confession is his only chance of forgiveness. Do exactly as I tell you.
But, George, if he knows, I'll have it out of him.